This past week, a video had started surfacing. I believe it was on CNN first. That's where I had saw it. But then it started circulating around different social media platforms. And it's a video of P. Diddy, also known as Sean Diddy Combs, beating his then girlfriend Cassie, physically assaulting her in a hotel lobby. And when I watched that video, my heart just broke and shattered. I'll be honest, I have always believed Cassie. I have always believed that she was in a really abusive, toxic relationship. This video gives light to some of the claims. It gives light to some of the accusations. I believe she even talked about this incident in the lawsuit. And I think it's important to have a conversation about abusive relationships. This is something that many people go through, many women walk through and go through, and yes, even men as well. Abusive relationships are something that I think there's an awareness of, but I also think there's still a lot of shame, guilt, misunderstanding around it. As a therapist who works with females, who has worked with females who are coming out of abusive relationships, there is still a sense of, I should have known better, I should have been better, I should have been smarter, I don't know how this happened to me, I would never think that this could happen to me. And as this video has come out, I'm still seeing that narrative of, well, she knew what she was getting into, she knew who he was, she knew blah, blah, blah. And I think we have to stop putting the spotlight on victims in that way. We need to better understand the psychological, the spiritual, and the physical toll that being in an abusive relationship can actually take on a person. So today, we are talking about abusive relationships. Before we dive into today's video, I do want to give a trigger warning. I will not be showing the video or showing any videos of any kind of abuse. I will be addressing things like physical abuse, mental abuse, spiritual abuse, emotional abuse, and financial abuse. If you have been in a situation of abuse, if you have walked through a situation of abuse with a friend and you might find this triggering, I want you to take care of your mental and emotional health and skip today's video, and then feel free to come back next time. So with that being said, let's dive on into today's video. So I briefly want to address the Cassie and Diddy situation because for me, I feel like this is putting domestic violence in such a unique spotlight. And I'm still seeing, like I said, a lot of rhetoric and verbiage around it where people are blaming Cassie for being in the situations or blaming Cassie for being so naive and thinking that she wouldn't be abused. I mean, how dare she think she would be in a healthy relationship? I think it's important to point out, number one, Cassie was extremely young when she got into a relationship with Diddy, and Diddy was the upper hand 100%, whether it came to age, power, money, whatever the case may be. Back in the day, I don't know if this is still true, but back in the day, I remember Diddy as being somebody who held a lot of power, especially for females who wanted anything to do with the music business. Now, Cassie, the only song I really remember of her is the Me and You song, which to this day is still iconic. But I remember that she was pursuing a music career. And back in the day, she was pursuing that. Diddy was the end-all be-all, especially for up-and-coming singers, especially in the R&B world. Now, I don't know much about Diddy and his background, and I want to be very careful in addressing Diddy and Cassie. And we're just taking the first few moments of this video to talk about it. Because it's really what triggered me to talk about domestic violence and hopefully bring some understanding and a light onto it in a healthier way. So anyway, a couple months ago, like I mentioned, Cassie did a lawsuit. She's now married and in a seemingly healthy relationship and a loving marriage, and has hopefully healed from what she alleges happened in the lawsuit. In the lawsuit, she alleges some really dark and heavy stuff. And one of the things that she talks about is actually the 2016, I believe, incident in the hotel. And that's the video apparently that has just come out. Now, that's all I have to say in regards to Diddy and Cassie. I'm hoping as things come out, because I really believe whatever's in the dark comes to light eventually, even for the rich and powerful. And I feel like that's what we're seeing a little bit of right now. And as things come out, I go right to Cassie's heart and head, because yes, people can move on and heal and, even have lives outside of the trauma that they've endured. But when things get revealed or when things are shown, so even like this video that has just come out, my heart goes to her, and I'm hoping and praying that she has a community of people who are just around her and surrounding her, who are going to love her and hold her hand through this trauma being re-triggered or these emotions being re-triggered. Because again, you can go through therapy, you can be healed and whole and still be re-triggered by things getting brought up. And to the degree and to the popularity and to the publicness of everything that's being brought up, I'm sure it's going to bring up a lot of emotions. I'm really hoping that her tribe, her community really just rallies around her, and that she still seeks therapy or professional help as well, because I can't imagine how hard this season of life is. Moving on, it really, like I said, it really made me think of how important it is to talk about what abusive relationships actually are. Again, I think there's some awareness of it. I think there's some compassion for it, but I still see a lot of misunderstanding around it. I still hear a lot of shame around it. And I think for people to be able to feel the ability to become free or to share their story, the stigma of shame has to be gone from being in an abusive relationship. And that's what I'm hoping I help contribute to. I'm hoping to cultivate healthy conversation of what abusive relationships look like, what they are, and possibly even how to work your way out of one if you find yourself one in now. So let's dive on in. So there are a couple of signs that I want to first start talking about when it comes to being in a possibly abusive situation or being in relationship with an abusive person. And unfortunately, some of these signs I think have become really romanticized, especially by book talk or movies or shows out there where we have romanticized potentially abusive relationships without even knowing it. One of the first ones I think of is jealousy. Now, obviously as humans, jealousy is part of human nature, but the jealousy I'm talking about is an extreme jealousy where it's a possession as well, where it's to the extreme of you can't even look at them, you can't even touch them, you can't even talk to them. And it's this control and this idea of if I can't have them, nobody else can. And this jealousy, I think, has, again, almost been romanticized in certain books or movies where we want this dominant, alpha person controlling or, being jealous of us. And it's not romantic. It's really toxic, unhealthy, and it can be abusive. So jealousy, possession, control, those are definite signs of being in an abusive relationship or being with a partner who is potentially abusive. Another sign can be really poor temper. So instead of getting upset and angry, which again, totally normal emotional reactions in any human, but poor temper meaning they go to an extreme rage and then they start either hitting or they start physically exerting their rage, whether it's on you or to the things around you. That is definitely a possible sign of a possible abuser, or that you're in an abusive, or that you are in a possibly abusive situation. Another thing when it comes to emotions or behavior is somebody who's really unpredictable in their behavior or in their emotions or how they express their emotions. And when I say that, I mean somebody who is maybe 1 minute like all about you and so loving and so adoring and whatever else word you want to put with that. But then in the next minute, something is said, something is done, something is dropped, something is whatever, and that person goes into that extreme rage. And so you never know what to expect from that person. Again, as humans, we're going to be up one, down one day, up another, down another, and that's normal. But what I'm talking about is extreme switches without any kind of warning, without any kind of control from that person, and it creates the feeling of whoever's in relationship with that person constantly walking on eggshells, because you don't know what's going to set them off, you don't know what you're going to do that's going to then create the rage in them. And so that is definitely a sign of somebody who is a possible abusive person, or that you're in a possibly abusive relationship. Another big sign that I don't think is talked about enough, and people kind of categorize it as just, oh, they're joking or they're just being sarcastic, but is really invalidating, demeaning, and shaming behavior, and verbiage around the person they're in relationship with. So somebody who's like, oh, they're so stupid, or you're so stupid, or who just publicly shames them or makes fun of them or invalidates them or always puts them down, whether it's again publicly or privately, that is a definite sign of somebody who is possibly an abuser. When we're in a relationship with somebody, yes, we're not going to like them 24/7. That's again normal. But when you're in a relationship with somebody, you should never be in a relationship with somebody who constantly tells you how stupid you are, how much of a moron you are, how they can't believe that they're dating you or married to you or in relationship with you, because nobody else would ever. You should never feel constant shame, constant embarrassment from the person you're in a relationship with because they're constantly putting you down. It is not funny. It is not somebody who's being sarcastic. It is not a joke. It is really cruel, toxic, and unhealthy, and yes, potentially abusive behavior. And then a couple more signs, and again, these are not all the signs, but these I would say are probably the most common signs. But a couple more signs is definitely financial control. So somebody who is going to take control financially. So whether, they have access to your bank accounts and you're not even like engaged, married, or anything like that, or they feel like they have the right to say anything and everything about where money goes and how money is spent, and you're not given any kind of say and you're not given any kind of respect when it comes to the finances. And yes, there is such a thing as being in a financially abusive relationship, which we'll get into in a little bit, but that's another big sign. And then last but not least, and again, this is a type of abuse that we'll get into in a little bit, but somebody who uses their faith against you or who uses spirituality as an abuse tactic. This is something that happens a lot within certain religions. So if you find yourself in a relationship where the person is constantly using their religion as a weapon against you, you're in a possibly abusive relationship with an abusive person. Again, these are just some of the signs of possibly being in an abusive relationship with a possibly or potentially abusive person. So that takes me to what are the types of abuse that people can endure in a relationship. And again, this is something that I think is so important to address because we assume that physical abuse is the only type of abuse that can be found in any kind of relationship, partnership, marriage, and that is just simply not the case. Yes, is physical abuse and it's horrific and it's horrible? Yes. It's not the only type though, and I think we have to break that stigma, and we have to cultivate more understanding of the different types of abuse. So we will start though with physical abuse. So again, physical abuse is literally what it sounds like, where it's the intentional bodily injury that is done to a person. So whether that is punching, kicking, throwing, grabbing, shaking, so on and so forth, any kind of physical harm is physical abuse in a relationship. Signs of that would obviously be like bruising or cuts or marks on a body that you're like, that doesn't look okay, or there's something wrong there. That is again probably the most commonly known form of abuse, and that is physical abuse. Another form of abuse or another type of abuse is going to be financial abuse. I briefly addressed this in the signs of abuse, but financial abuse is when somebody again completely takes over the finances and uses them to weaponize you, uses them to hold you hostage, uses them as some form of way of putting you down or continuing to control what you cannot do. That is a form of abuse. Another form of abuse is unfortunately sexual and coercion type of abuse. And yes, this can even happen within relationships, partnerships, and marriages. And this is again something that's not talked about enough. Just because you're married to somebody does not mean that kind of abuse does not and cannot happen. Non-consensual sex or sexual acts or certain behaviors in a relationship pertaining to that is abuse. That is not what marriage is, and that's how sometimes I think spiritual abuse tends to happen or is used, especially when it comes to the bedroom. Men, I've seen it and heard it, where men will use scripture or their faith or beliefs to coerce or to let the person know that, hey, you're meant to give this to me or do this for me every single time that I want it, and that is simply not true and not the case. So yes, that is a type of abuse as well. Another form of abuse is going to be mental and or emotional abuse, and this one is, I think for me, what I see a lot in my office. And again, this is me personally and professionally, what I see in my office. I see a lot of mental and emotional abuse. So when it comes to mental and emotional abuse, some of the common traits of that is going to be gaslighting. It's going to be isolation. It's going to be constantly shaming, invalidating, putting down with words. And what mental and emotional abuse can do, which I think is important to note, and because I think this is where people get lost in, well, how do they even fall into this? Or how does this even happen? Or, I would never because I'm too smart. Mental and emotional abuse literally works from the inside out. And it starts off as like maybe love bombing, or you feel like the best person in the world, but then like that, you feel like the worst person in the world. And they're like, okay, they just had a rough moment, so I'll forgive them. But then it goes into a cycle, which we'll get into a cycle in just a little bit. But mental and emotional abuse, again, works from the inside out. And this is where I feel like a lot of misunderstanding happens. You can not have a bruise on you and still be in an abusive relationship. If you are with somebody who, again, publicly or privately constantly puts you down, embarrasses you, makes fun of you, belittles you, invalidates you, shames you, embarrasses you, the list goes on. That is a form of abuse. Typically behaviors like controlling, jealousy, like I mentioned, or the constant angry yelling is how mental and emotional abuse typically happens from the abuser, where a human can only take so much aggression and yell and control that it just literally wears them down to where they feel like they can't do anything right and they can't do anything to make the situation better. So they're just going to surrender to whatever the abuser wants. And again, that's how mental and emotional abuse typically works. So again, another form of abuse is mental and emotional. And then we have spiritual abuse. And this is something, again, that I unfortunately have seen a lot, especially within the Christian faith. I'm also aware that happens in other religions as well. But again, with spiritual abuse, so it's the twisting and the manipulating of spirituality, scripture, religion, faith, all that stuff to weaponize against the person that they are abusing. The abuser will typically use it for their benefit, and they'll use it and twist it and turn it to where whoever they're in relationship with will constantly feel bad because they want to make sure that they're pleasing, whether it's God or whoever they worship. And the abuser will know that. And I think that kind of falls under like the mental and emotional abuse, but spiritual abuse is very much a real thing and something that unfortunately is used a lot. All that to say, those are the common types of abuse that people can go through. So yes, physical abuse is definitely something that people experience when in a domestic violent relationship. But there are other types of abuse that people do go through and walk through and struggle through that I think we just need to be more aware of or more cognizant of. Just because you don't see physical scarring, physical bruises on somebody does not mean that they're not in an abusive relationship. So let's quickly talk about what the typical cycle of abuse is. Now, there's typically 4 stages in an abusive relationship, and not all abuse goes through these stages. But when it comes to like a cycle, most professionals list these 4 steps as the typical cycle of abuse. So the first one is going to be the tension. So basically what that means is the abused and the abuser, there's like a tension building, and typically the person who's being abused, they're kind of walking on eggshells, they're watching what they're saying, because they can feel, like we can feel when atmosphere and tension is shifting in a room, in a space. And so they can start to feel that, and the abuser starts to get really aggravated, frustrated, just kind of like just mean and short and just not nice. And there's a level of tension that's literally so thick, and both people can feel it. So that's typically the first stage. Then the second stage, or the second step of the cycle, is going to be the actual incident. So again, whether it's the constant berating, whether it is the physical violence, whether it's some other form of abuse, but step 2 is going to be the actual incident of the abuse. So the explosion, we'll call it. And then step 3 is typically known as like the honeymoon phase or the makeup phase, where the abuser is very aware of, oh crap, I messed up, I had an explosion. But it's not that they want to necessarily change behavior. They just want to make sure that that person stays with them throughout, the next cycle. So it's like flowers and just love bombing, and you mean everything. I don't know what I would do without you. You can't leave me. And so the person in that relationship will start to feel bad and like, okay, well, maybe they'll change next time. And there's a glimmer of hope that tends to happen. And so they hold on to that hope, and they unfortunately typically stay in the relationship. And then the fourth state is literally just like known as the calm state. So it's almost like this big storm happens and then just like a calming where we're good, things are good. And it sometimes lasts long enough for both people to be like, oh, okay, maybe that was just a fluke incident. Maybe that's not what, is the norm. And maybe they just had a really bad day. And so that's how typically, again, people, it's a glimmer of hope of, okay, that's not who they are. That was just a really bad moment. And so they hold on to that until the tension starts building and then the cycle starts over again. That is, again, what's commonly known as the cycle of abuse. So let's talk about what somebody might say or feel when they're in an abusive relationship, because I think when we are friends with people who are in unhealthy, possibly abusive relationship, these are common phrases that we might hear, we might think. And a lot of times we will get frustrated. It's like, oh, they're not great for you. And typically we don't know everything that's happening behind the scenes. But I think if we understand what they're saying, maybe it'll give more insight of how we can respond a little differently. Because with abusive relationships, typically what will happen, especially in the beginning, which is part of the mental and emotional mess, they will actually isolate. So the person who is like the abuser in the relationship will actually isolate the person that they're in relationship with from friends, family, because the ultimate goal is for the abuser to be the sole source of income, sole source of reliability, sole source of support, sole source of spiritual growth and health, sole source for literally everything. And so it's really hard for people who are in abusive relationships to have healthy community or to have friends in their lives or family in their lives because they've been isolated from them. And yes, that is a real mental, emotional thing that can happen. And it's not the victim's fault. It literally is such a whirlwind that happens in their brain that even the smartest people can get caught up in these abusive relationships. And so that is something, again, I just need to share and I need people to understand. But again, let's talk about some of the phrases that typically people in abusive relationships will say. Well, I know that they love me and they're not like this all the time. So they're not violent all the time. They're not, they're not violent all the time. They're not always putting me down. They're not whatever the abusive all the time. And that is a phrase that, again, they hold on to this idea of hope of, well, they love me and they just had a bad moment, or they love me and this isn't an everyday occurrence. Here's the thing. What the abuser will do is isolate the person so much and convince them, whether it's how they talk, how they act, how they use, again, spirituality to convince them, whatever the case may be, but they will literally convince the person they're in relationship with, this is what love is. This is how love looks. This is what love, is supposed to feel like. And they'll make them feel bad, and to the point of like, oh yeah, you're right. Okay, this is what it is. And so oftentimes phrases like that of, well, I know that they love me and they didn't mean to fill in the blank. That is a common phrase of somebody who is in an unhealthy, toxic, and yes, a possibly abusive relationship. Another big one that I hear a lot is, well, it's my fault. I shouldn't have made them mad. I shouldn't have done this. And again, because of the isolation and because of the mental and emotional abuse and the manipulation that has taken place, almost anything that happens, the person will feel like, oh, because I said this, that's why they had that reaction. Because I did this, that's why they had that reaction. I need people to know and understand that we are not responsible for people's reaction to things. People can respond and even react to things that we say or do, but those reactions should never lead to somebody putting physical harm on us, putting mental and emotional harm on us, using spirituality to harm us. Never, ever should that happen. It is never your fault for somebody to put hands on you. It is never your fault for somebody to use the Bible or spirituality to weaponize it against you. It is never your fault for somebody to continue to manipulate and emotionally and mentally abuse the mess out of you. That is not your fault. And again, oftentimes, especially in my office, I've heard this and it just hurts my heart. And that's a belief and thought we work through diligently. It is not your fault. Another common phrase that I hear in my office is, well, they need me. And if I'm not with them, I don't know what's going to happen to them. Or they need me, and if I'm not with them, then they're going to hurt themselves because they've threatened to do so before, or, end their life. That is a form of mental and emotional abuse. If you are in a relationship and it's unhealthy and you constantly feel put down, if you constantly feel bad in it, and you're wanting to get out, and that person says, well, if you leave me, I'm gonna end my life. Well, if you leave me, my blood is on your hands. That is a sure sign of mental and emotional abuse. And so that's another common phrase or common saying that I hear, unfortunately, here in my office when somebody is in an abusive relationship. So again, those are some of the common things that I hear in my office. But the last thing I want to talk about is leaving an abusive relationship. And before I talk about some of like the professional tips of leaving a relationship, I first want to address the idea of leaving an abusive relationship. There's this misconception of, well, just pack your bags and leave. You see, when somebody's in an abusive relationship, there's actually a really high rate of, if they leave, the person that was abusing them will come after them and mentally harm them, physically harm them, and it can actually be a really dangerous time. And again, I've seen this a lot with the whole Cassie situation, where they're like, well, why was she in a relationship with him for so long if he was doing that to her? It's mind-boggling, because I'm like, I don't think people understand the mental and emotional toll that abuse does to people. Instead of saying, oh my gosh, about time, they were horrible this whole time, saying, hey, how can I sit with you in this moment? How can I partner with you to make sure that you get the best therapy, that you seek out the best professional and just mental and emotional help that you can get? Things like that is so much better, because when somebody comes out of an abusive relationship and then they get met with shame, it can spiral them back into that same abusive relationship, because it's just proven the abuser's point, nobody really cares about you, or it can spiral them into a really unhealthy state, and that's just not the place that we want them to be. So with that little tangent done, here are some professional tips when it comes to leaving an abusive relationship. Number one is going to be staying aware of red flags. So again, like I mentioned, there's a tension point when it comes to the cycle of abuse. Not that you're always going to know, and sometimes you don't really know when the explosion is going to happen, but staying aware and vigilant of red flags, so of behavior shifts, of wording, or how they treat you shifts. Being vigilant and aware of that can make us more in tune of, okay, something's going to happen, or we're not in a safe situation, or we need to go do something about it. So that is something to keep in mind if you find yourself in an abusive relationship. Number two, if you can't leave and if that's not the plan for you right now, find safe spots in your home, in the space that you're in. So whether it's in your home or right outside your home, finding safe spots to go to when the person you're in a relationship with is having an explosion or about to have an explosion can help protect us physically, but just even mentally and emotionally, it can keep us guarded from the person who's trying to come at us. Again, it's not foolproof or anything like that, but it can help at least guard or slow down the process. Have a code word. If you have a friend or a family member who is still in your life, have a code word to send them or to share with them or to tell them, or whatever the case may be, so they can come and help or do something to help, again, stop the situation or help you escape the situation. So again, having a code word can just be helpful because it's really convenient and easy to send out, and it doesn't give away information to the person that is the abuser and coming after you. Another professional tip is have a to-go bag ready. Having a small go bag can be really helpful, especially in the moment when you're like, okay, this is the time I get to leave. And again, this is just filled with simple essentials, not everything. Something along that line as well, professional tip, is having a practice run of escaping. Again, leaving an abusive relationship is one of the hardest things that somebody will do. It's one of the hardest things that you may find yourself having to do. And so making sure that you give yourself some grace, but practicing the exit, practicing the run, practicing what the exit's going to look like can be really helpful. And then last but not least, when it comes to a professional tip, is not being afraid to ask for help. So whether it's you call the hotline, which the number is 800-799-7233, or if again you call a family member and they come pick you up and take you, or you call a therapist even and you start the therapy process and journey and you make a plan with a therapist to help get you out of the situation. But calling for help can be a huge game changer when leaving an abusive relationship. I know today's video is not an easy topic, and it is a heavy topic, but it's one that I want to, again, continue to help cultivate healthy conversation around, because it's a conversation that I think where there's a lot of awareness, but again, there's a lot of misunderstanding as well. And so I'm hoping that this video helps provide understanding to what domestic violence can actually look like and feel like. I'm hoping it brings understanding to those who maybe have found themselves in a situation who is currently in an abusive relationship, and maybe you're like, oh, I didn't realize that was abuse. I'm hoping that it brings understanding and some sense of freedom to you. I'm hoping it brings understanding to maybe family or friends who have been trying to figure out why their friend or family is in an abusive relationship, or they have found themselves frustrated with their friend or family who's in an unhealthy, toxic, or an abusive relationship. I'm hoping that helps bring some compassion and understanding to you as well. Again, I am so thankful that you decided to watch today's video, and I'm hoping that you learned something. I'm hoping it empowered you, it encouraged you, and it equipped you. If you are interested in all things mental health, therapy, pop culture, reality TV, then this might be the channel for you. And I would love for you to go ahead and hit that subscribe button, hit that like button, turn on your notifications. That way you're notified when brand new videos are out and ready for you to view. Be sure to tune in next time for a brand new video.